Hello everyone, this is Eric DeBoard, Azure TSP in Education at Microsoft. I've done a couple of series of videos, and today I'm going to start a new series about Azure Site Recovery. So we're going to spend some time talking about Azure Site Recovery, and we're going to apply that to education specifically. We get a lot of interest in site recovery. It's a very powerful tool set, and so we wanted to take some time to talk to you about it. This will be a number of videos. This is the introduction video, and in this video we're going to talk about just a quick architecture review, some scenarios, and why you want to use site recovery. So basically, in Azure, we support a couple of scenarios around backup, recovery, and migration. On this slide, I'm highlighting Azure Backup, which we're going to talk about in a separate video, but I want to talk more specifically about Azure Site Recovery. Basically, Azure Site Recovery is a solution that allows you to take your on-premise workloads, whether they be physical servers, virtual machines that run in VMware, virtual machines that run in Hyper-V, whether they be SAP workloads, Oracle workloads, SQL Server, or even EC2 instances. Those all can be used and replicated to Azure for purposes of site recovery and business continuity. This solution basically encrypts your data as it crosses the wire. It is encrypted at rest in Azure, and it sits there in Azure in storage until the day comes along that you want to do something with it. So the great benefit of this solution is that it does only cost small charges for storage and instance fees versus what you'd typically pay to have a disaster recovery solution. Over to the right here, we can see a little bit more of what this solution covers. We basically have a number of supported scenarios. So you can use site recovery to replicate VMs between your own site and Azure here. And so that could be any of the workloads we just talked about. So VMware, physical, Hyper-V workloads. We basically can replicate all those workloads to Azure and make Azure your recovery site, which means that you're using storage and networking in Azure. Another scenario is that you can have, if you have your own site and you have your own infrastructure, Azure can be the orchestration engine to replicate or ensure that your data is replicated either through a solution like Hyper-V replication or even through third-party SAN replication tools. So just know that this solution is helpful in both of those scenarios. The solution also provides monitoring, health monitoring, so you always know what's happening in your environment. And it is a great way to do testing. So you can bring up your environment for testing at any time to really sort of work out how you bring that environment online if ever needed. There is a group back in the 90s that really sort of dictated what a disaster recovery solution should look like, and they categorized this into a number of tiers. That was the shared standards group. Those tiers went from tier 0, which was no offsite disaster recovery plan, all the way to tier 7, which is a highly automated business integrated solution. Now, when I go out and talk to my customers, I hear all sorts of scenarios and stories and capabilities. Most of those range in the area of tier 1 to 4. Rarely do I talk to a customer that has a highly automated business integrated solution. Well, the good news is that's what Azure Site Recovery does provide you. It provides you every tier that you see here because it does give you the ability to do automation through orchestration. Just to point out some of the major benefits of Azure Site Recovery. You only pay for storage and instance charges. That's what we talked about earlier. This is a significant savings over what you typically save or spend, when you are replicating to a third-party data center, because typically you're paying for compute and storage as well as networking infrastructure, even if you're not using those workloads. The second thing here, full orchestration and control over testing. So once you get your workloads replicated out to Azure, you have full control of being able to bring those workloads online through testing and to iteratively bring them online until you work out your specific scenario. So you get to bring up groups of servers separately in a timed way, in a way that makes sense for how your workloads integrate and work with each other. One of the other great benefits of site recovery is it can be used for planned migration. Planned migration is basically setting up site recovery as you would for a disaster. However, instead of using it to actually fail over for purposes of a real disaster, you fail over in a planned way so that you have migrated your workloads to Azure. That's a fantastic tool for a planned migration. And the reason is because of the next setting, or the next item we have here on the list, which is recovery point objective options of 30 seconds, 5 minutes, or 15 minutes. So this solution does provide you up to a 30-second window of replication to Azure, meaning Azure would theoretically always be only 30 seconds behind what you're running on premise. Now, of course, that depends on your bandwidth and your workloads, but those capabilities exist natively in this solution. So you get to choose one of these three options, and you can do different choices for different workloads. You have full granularity in how you deploy this site recovery solution. The next thing here is that you can use your current subnets or change subnets in Azure. When you go through a test recovery or a real recovery, you always get a choice of a network that you want to bring your environment up on. So you could bring your environment up into a failover subnet in Azure, or you could bring it into a network in Azure that's connected back on-premise through some sort of site-to-site connectivity. And you can change that at any time, so you have full control over how those workloads might fail over. So if you're doing just a test failover, you might want to bring it up in an entirely isolated environment. Or if you're doing a real failover, you might want to bring it up in an environment that's routable back to on-premise. So you have full control with that. And of course, while you're doing testing, you can see how those work. The next thing is you have full control of IP settings during failover and testing. So just like bringing your own subnets and changing your subnets or using different subnets in Azure, you can also define what IP settings are specific to each virtual machine as you bring them up in Azure. So you actually can choose static addresses if you want, or you can let Azure assign IP addresses for you. And you can change those with every failover, so you have full control over how that works as well. You also have full flexibility to choose compute sizing. So maybe your workloads, when you're doing test failovers, you want to use smaller VMs because you just don't want to use the power of compute for a test failover. Maybe you just want to see that all the machines get turned on as a first test. You can choose very small VMs to make that happen. As you move along later, or let's say you have a failover or you do a planned migration, you can always change the compute size. That basically involves changing the size, and the VM will reboot into the larger size of compute. So it's a very simple operation. The next thing here is that we have remote monitoring capabilities. So any solution that you are replicating to Azure, you always understand the status of that replication, the percentage of that replication, and if there are any failures in that replication, because you actually also get to set up alerts and be able to monitor your Azure Site Recovery solution entirely. So the next thing I want to show you here is the website for site recovery, because it's important to be able to take a look at these options in the future for yourself as they change regularly. So what I've done here is I've gone to the Azure website, I've clicked on documentation, and I went down here under management and monitoring, clicked on site recovery, which loads our landing page. And if you go from here and say that you want to plan, you can do prepare for deployment, you can watch an introduction, all sorts of options here you see. What I want to show is, let's just go down a path here so I can show you some of the things that are available. So what is site recovery? Well, we just talked about that, but there are a few things on here that I wanted to point out for you. For example, we do provide some details here around what is available. We point out that you can replicate to Azure as a recovery site or between your own sites as well. There also are some details here around what you can replicate. So here you can see VMware VMs replicate from VMware Server to Azure. So this gives you all of the different scenarios that are supported. It's good for a reference. And then you can also see what types of workloads can I protect. So application consistent snapshots will be taken of VMs and replicated to Azure. You can also integrate with SQL Server Always On. So just be aware of this web page. I want to show you another link that's really important here as well. What workloads can site recovery protect? So if we take a look at this, all sorts of options here, but I wanted to focus in here at this workload summary. So here we can see Active Directory, of course, is a supported solution. Web apps, that's IS, or Internet Information Server and SQL. SCOM is a supported scenario. SharePoint, SAP. So if you're running SAP on site, you can replicate that to Azure, and that is fully tested and supported in Azure for all the scenarios here you see. Exchange. If you're using Exchange without a DAG, that is supported to be replicated to Azure in 3 of the 4 scenarios. Remote desktop VDI is supported. You can see here also that Oracle is supported. So Oracle is fully tested and supported by Microsoft to run in Site Recovery and to be recoverable in Site Recovery. So keep that in mind. There's a lot of solutions here. They change. You might come here after you watch this video and see that there are already updates, because updates happen on a regular basis. If you scroll down the page, we give you more specifics about each of these solutions. So you can see there are specific scenarios associated with each of these. And if you wanted to learn more about SAP, you could click that link there. Finally, I wanted to show one other web page here, which is Prepare Azure Site Recovery Deployment. Lots of information here to look at as well. We have the different scenarios and what you need to know about each of those scenarios, but I wanted to skip down here and just highlight, check what you need for deployment. So we need an Azure account, of course. You can't create anything in Azure without an Azure account. You'll need Azure storage. So when VMs are replicated to Azure, they're going to go to storage that you've created in Azure. Don't worry, we're going to go through all this in our video series here, but I want to point out the site. You need Azure networks. So how am I going to bring up those workloads once they get to Azure? If you're using Virtual Machine Manager, which we're going to use in our demo here, network mapping is important. So if it's on this network on-premise, what network do I want it in when it hits Azure? And finally, on premises, you need something to replicate. So VMware VMs, physical, Hyper-V VMs. Also, just to point out down here that there are a similar enumeration of requirements if you're replicating to a secondary site, if that's your solution. And then finally, I wanted to point out that the URLs that you'll need access to if you set up site recovery are listed here. So all this information is available to you online. And finally, what are the virtual machine requirements? So just check out all these different scenarios. You'll notice here that our limit here for disk size is 1 terabyte in Azure. If you have workloads that use more than 1 terabyte on a single disk, there are workarounds for that. So just keep that in mind as well. For the most part, though, you'll see that these settings or requirements fit most of your workloads. Okay. That's all for the introduction video. Next, we're going to get started with reviewing a deployment scenario and starting the demo.